Okay, so today I'll be talking about 1.5 developments in Africa. So, essential question: how and why did states develop in Africa and change over time? Ibn Battuta's commentary on Mali society shed light on the cultural forces at work in sub-Saharan Africa during the 14th century. A scholar from Morocco on the northwest coast of Africa, he was well versed in Islamic law, also known as Sharia. We're going to move on to our next subtitle: Political structures in inland Africa. The developments of sub-Saharan Africa was heavily by migration of Bantu speaking people outwards from West Central Africa. By the year 1000, most of the regions had adopted agriculture. People needed more complex political relationships to govern themselves. In contrast to most Asian or European societies, in sub-Saharan Africa formed a kin-based networks where families governed themselves. A male head of the network, a chief, mediated conflicts and dealt with neighboring groups. Though as population grew, kin-based networks became more difficult to govern. The Hansia Kingdom. It formed 7 states. The states were loosely connected through kinship ties, though they had also no central authority. Hansia benefited from thriving trans-Saharan trade, a network of trading routes across the Great Desert. In the 14th century, missionaries introduced Islam to the region. Our next subtitle: Political structures of West and East Africa. Exchange of goods brought them wealth, political power, and cultural diversity. The spread of Islam added to the religious diversity of the continent, where animism and Christianity were already practiced. 4 of these kingdoms were Ghana, Mali, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia. I'll be explaining them. Ghana, located between the Sahara and West African rainforest. It's a different location than modern Ghana. Rulers sold gold and ivory to Muslim traders in exchange for salt, copper, cloth, and tools. The king ruled a centralized government and with nobles and an ironclad army. Mali. Ghana weakened in the 12th century. This society arose and most powerful new trading society. The founder was likely a Muslim and used his connections to establish trade relationships with North Africa and Arab merchants. Sandeta created a profitable gold trade. The society becomes very wealthy. Zimbabwe. The name means dwelling in Bantu. They made their house of stone, prospered on agriculture, grazing trade, and gold. Most powerful nation in East Africa in the 12th to 15th century. Zimbabwe was tied into the Indian Ocean trade, which connected East Asia, Middle East, South Asia, and the East Asia. Next is Ethiopia. Christianity had spread through it, and to compete with Islam, its influence was weakened in Africa. They made 11 churches of entirely rock island of Christianity in Africa, developed in the dependency of Catholic of Orthodox churches. Moving on to our next subtitle: Social structures of Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa's small communities were organized around several structures: kinship, age, and gender. Kinship connections allowed people to identify first as members of a clan or family. Men dominated most activities that required a specialized skill. For example, leather tanners and blacksmiths were typically men. A woman generally engaged in agriculture and food gathering. They also took primary responsibility for carrying out domestic chores and raising their family's children. The next subject: slavery in sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Africa. Slavery had a long history in Africa. Prisoners of war, debutators, and criminals were often enslaved. Most men and some women did agricultural work, and some served in households. Owning a large number of enslaved people increased one's social class. A strong demand in the Middle East for enslaved workers resulted in Indian Ocean slave trade between East Africa and the Middle East. The Zhang Rebellion. Enslaved East Africans, known as Arabic as Zang, provided a valuable labor on sugar plantations in Mesopotamia. Between 869 and 883, Arab workers mounted series of revolts. One of these, led by Ali bin Muhammad, became known as Zang Rebellion. And our last, some examples or pictures. Our last subject is cultural life in sub-Saharan Africa. Playing music, creating visual arts, and telling stories were and continue to be an important part of cultures everywhere. In Africa, it carries significance like religious purposes. Example would be music and visual arts. Griots and gritis. Literature in sub-Saharan Africa was oral. Griots were storytellers and conducts of history. And that is all for this. Oh, there's some images, and that's all for this chapter.